All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and we have an exciting episode to bring you today. We are talking to a senior economist from the REA who has the most incredibly rich data at his fingertips, Ben, and also has a backstory at the RBA. And we ask lots of questions around that. But what else do we cover, mate?
Well, mate, we're going to learn about property values and this whole concept of gravity centres. So that is huge information that Paul shares as part of the research that he's found about what drives property values. So hang around for that. And finally, in What's Making Property News, I'm going to give everyone a timely reminder nationally about making sure you're not paying too much land tax. So hang around for that as well.
It is a good tip, folks. We've got lots to cover today. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and welcome back to you too, mate, on the eve of the AFL finals. You can feel it in the air, can't you?
Oh, you can, and the air's cold, mate, and it's going to be wet by the looks of things after a nice couple of days. The cool changes come through, so she might be a bit of a wet match tonight between two traditional rivals.
Are you a bit nervous, mate?
Of course. I mean, like at the end of the day, like any of these sort of things, we've got a good enough team to win if we're all fit and healthy. Nick is obviously Mr. Football. I'm going to call him now. Nick Dacos. He's a big out, but other than that, we're looking pretty good.
So, mate, here's the beautiful thing for the rest of us, mate. You've worked hard all year. You've got yourself to the top of the ladder, just sitting beautifully, and you've got zero home advantage. I love it because you're actually playing the team who shares the ground with you in the Melbourne Demons. Oh, it's just beautiful. It couldn't happen any better, could it?
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, it would have been nice to be playing Port, wouldn't it, right, with 90,000 screaming Pie supporters and only 5,000 Port supporters. But no, it is what it is. And at the end of the day, you've got to beat whatever team's in front of you. So,
well played. I like how you're doing that. So, we should say to our audience that this is probably the only finals banter that we will have. We may sneak a little bit in for the grand final because you and I have got some leave coming up. So, but not to worry for our podcast community because we've got some incredible content and some incredible guests to share during that time. But we won't be able to have the live commentary, Ben. So it's kind of going to go hard here and then go dark.
Well, it could be a blessing in disguise if we go out in straight sets, but it also could be like, I won't be able to rub my hands together if we've gone straight through the prelim.
Everyone's just like,
because this is obviously, because the next couple of episodes, we won't get to talk about this. You know what my nightmare scenario is, and I'm happy to put this out in the public airways, is that we lose against Melbourne and then Carlton say they beat Sydney and then we play Carlton Collingwood. That would just they're the sort of team that I just never want to lose to in a final, right? In terms of Carlton Collingwood. So
you just made the plot even thicker. Thanks for sharing your heart there, mate.
I thought I'd share it just because there could be a lot of smiles on a few people's faces.
How many people will be going for Carlton? All the people across the country are now Carlton supporters. It's brilliant.
But I have a lot of belief in the boys. I have a lot of belief that won't play out.
All right, folks, we will not labour on AFL any further than to say it's clear who Ben wants to win the grand final. I'm just going to declare that I'm going for Brisbane. I hope they beat you in the final, Ben, and I hope they beat you by sort of Dom Sheed-esque, just in the last.
In the last. Yeah, nothing changes with you. You just want to make sure it's almost there, but not quite.
Yeah. Exactly. So there you go. All right. I was going to say congrats, but good luck to everyone who's got teams in the final.
Yes, good luck to all the 8 teams.
Clearly, I don't. Hey, just want to talk about some feedback that you and I have received, Ben.
Yes.
And I think it's a fair call, the feedback that we've received. So I'm going to read it out. So just if anyone wonders, if they leave us some feedback on iTunes, we do periodically read them and go through them and use them as opportunities to grow as podcasters and as humans. So this one's come from Josie Ralph, who left this at the end of August. Ben. So very, very fresh. The title is Insightful and Passionate. So, all right, sounds pretty good so far, Ben. Hey guys, love your work. Just wanted to offer a quick suggestion. I've noticed a tendency to emphasize the accurate predictions whilst downplaying the ones that didn't quite hit the mark. This might unintentionally give off an impression of being less than sincere. For instance, you often refer back to your February forecast of an interest rate hold at 3.35 to 3.6%. But I recall your fairly confident prediction in December that it would stay on hold at 3.1%, even though rates ended up rising 100 basis points over the next 5 meetings. If it held at 3.1, you would have claimed that you predicted it, but then you threw that one out and claim a revised prediction after the rate rise in February. A more honest reflection would help build more trust with listeners and, in brackets, and potential clients like me. Nonetheless, I'm really appreciative of the content you provide. Your expertise is truly valuable, and I'm grateful for the knowledge shared by both of you. Keep up the good work. Now, Ben, there is a life lesson here for everyone. The way to give someone feedback is the way Josie's just did it. Compliment at the front, compliment at the back, recommendation in the middle. So it's called the sandwich. So, what do you feel about that, Ben? It's probably a fair call. It's probably highlighting that you and I are humans.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, ultimately, we did get those calls wrong, and we try and one of the important things we just need to remember: we try and isolate the cash rate decision as it will impact property. But absolutely, we were making predictions based on the forecast that we were seeing from most of those economists, and we were trying to relate those into the property story. Now, the truth is we got those wrong, and so Josie's absolutely right in regards to what that story looks like. So thank you for that feedback. In terms of the property story, that one seems to have played out a little bit more in our favour. I mean, one of the greatest problems you have with macroeconomics, they call it the dismal science for a reason, right? Because it is a social science, and it's incredibly difficult to consistently be accurate in your forecasting, and we're no different. That's why a lot of commentators and the like really just don't play in that space because they don't like to be wrong. We try to give you guidance in terms of where we see it fitting, only in the context of the property story, but we've also mentioned as well that if people are taking on our feedback around where we see the cash rate landing and they're making decisions on lending fixed rates or variable rates, then it's really important for people to also take those messages on board. So that's why this type of feedback is important to us, because we know that people may be making generalized decisions off the back of that. So here's a point to make. We may not be out of the woods yet in regards to the cash rate, services inflation, as what was discussed by the RBA board. That's our problem area there. We saw the economists and also a lot of market feedback from public listed markets is that they are continuing to push through with higher price increases and double-digit price increases, which is going to be interesting. And that's why for the several months up to now, I've been pleading with people to stop spending. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in my next RBA and economic update, because there's a real piece of information in here that I want everyone to be aware of. And that is, I've fallen victim to this idea that consumers will be more conservative with their savings and their money, but it's proven to be fruitless in terms of, no, you give people money and the bulk of them spend it. And that's what we're basically saying in terms of why we've got higher interest rates than we actually need to have, is because businesses can continually keep passing on prices because we keep happily accepting these increases.
When we say money is simple, behaviour is hard, maybe we should say economics is simple, but people's behaviour is hard to read, right? So I guess we're not spreadsheets. We make emotional decisions. We make decisions to make us feel good in the moment. We make decisions based on history in some parts of the country being locked up for a long time. So there's a whole bunch of human emotions. So to your point, Josie, Ben and I have human emotions too, right? We want to avoid decreasing our status by saying we're wrong. But I reckon the feedback is fair. So hopefully, here's a couple of things. we don't always get it right, but we always give 100% of our understanding at the time of making the call, and I feel like our history has proven that. Also, it just proves we're like every other forecaster. Sometimes we're lucky, and sometimes we get a stroke of reality. So we've seen that too. But here's a couple of things. Part of the conversation, and to your point, Ben, and maybe is this me trying to justify it again as part of trying to increase status rather than decrease status? But part of what we're doing as well is, to your point around the property story, is trying to be a voice of calm as well. And in the midst of headlines that are scary, in the midst of lots of negative clickbait stuff, we were the voice of calm through the pandemic, and we look back on that with a sense of pride because that calm proved to be correct. And obviously, there's a whole bunch of anxiety that comes from an interest rate tightening cycle that we've just experienced. So we're trying to provide some calm there as well in reference to the property market. But there you go. We are putting it out there. If you're using you and I as a reference for where the cash rate is going to go, you're probably flawed in your thinking. but we're having the best swing that we can. So thanks for highlighting this, Josie. A very timely reminder to our community that Ben and I are very much flawed. So we should take some time to acknowledge that. But I feel like the heart of anyone who's listened to our podcast, maybe I'm justifying again, Ben, maybe at the heart of the history of our podcast, we've tried to give as much as we can to the benefit of our community. So with that as a backdrop, that just proves if anyone gives us feedback, Ben, we don't always just read out the good ones. We also read out the stuff that gives us some opportunity to straighten up as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we made some, poor judgment calls around the oversupply that arrived in the Brisbane market for some of the clients that we bought some properties for. So, during that sort of 16, 17 buying season for us in those particular markets, those properties yields have held up, but obviously their capital growth has been challenged. So you're always going to make mistakes in what we do. And to your point, we're just trying to bring all of the experience and the data together to make, a conversation around what we see. I have been thinking a little bit about changing the approach for next year in alignment with what's going to be happening with the RBA. They're going to move to only 8 meetings a year. And I think considering that we are long-term investors and we have a long-term view of property, the monthly economic and RBA update can get can get people focused in on the real here and now and the short term. And, and when you're reading the paper, you can get that sentiment challenge and what we call recency bias. So I am thinking about maybe turning those more into more quarterly updates and giving the sort of more bigger picture. I mean, I read a lot of data out during those sessions and some of it might be wasted, but I'm trying to build a narrative for each market that I'm looking at. And I get some great feedback on it in terms of people really, giving them some sense. But to the point I'm trying to make is really month to month to month to month is really irrelevant in terms of what you're trying to do. Where we're trying to get to is basically holding long-term assets for a longer period of time and building that passive wealth off the top of that. So really appreciate the feedback. We'll continue to keep doing our best. But to that point, we won't, we'll avoid the hubris around, declaring we're correct when, maybe earlier on we had earlier predictions on the cash rate, which were wrong.
But Josie, I promise you, if Brisbane wins by under a kick in the grand final, I will have an unbelievable amount of hubris that'll be going on here. I will be shouting from the rooftops that I called it. So there you go. I think I called it on the Today Show, Ben. You and I were on the Today Show.
That's on record, right? That's on record. There's a couple of things that have been interesting when we are not only on our, on this podcast, but also when we've been on the Today Show and other things. There's that famous call from you, and then on the Today Show, that breakfast show in the morning, and I said, they asked me what I've got my scarf on, saying, and I don't think we'll win. So that was a bit silly of me to I should have been more confident in the boys on that day. But there's the other one at the Australian Open, which one's a classic as well, where I'm getting asked by Ali in terms of what's going to happen with the cash rate, and I said, oh no, the cash rate could go lower from here, and she's going, what? There's absolutely no way the cash rate could go lower than the 2% or 2.1% at a time. And look where it went to, in terms of that. So you just never know. I mean, and this is the problem with macroeconomic forecasting. It's just so hard because there's so many moving parts, and black swan events, change everything. And obviously, government decisions change everything, in terms of, how an economy responds based on its natural growth, but also the regulatory implications that happen both domestically and also globally.
There you go, folks. Continue to keep us accountable for the information that we share with you on the way to helping you create your lifestyle by design, listening to this podcast. Hey, the Mindset Minute theme today is getting close towards wrapping up, Ben, with
Yep.
The Art of Spending, the anecdotes of spending money by Morgan Housel. Today we're up to number 12, and it's a really good one. So the social hierarchy of spending, positioning you against your peers. So at the beginning, he talks about this old joke, Ben. You probably heard it. There's two hikers out in the woods, and they come across a bear. One of the hikers puts on his shoes and he starts to run. The other hiker says, "Are you crazy? You can't outrun a bear." To which the runner says, "I don't need to run faster than a bear. I just need to run faster than you." So good way to frame up the discussion, right? So
Yeah.
he says, all success is simply relative to somebody else. So am I going to be successful from the bear? Well, relative to if you're a slower runner than me, the answer is yes. So it's usually those around you. So there's no object measure of wealth or success, except potentially the wealthiest person in the world. And outside of that, then everyone else still has someone to objectively strive for, right? So
Yeah.
it's just relative to the people around you. Are you doing better or worse than they are? That's important for spending, because for so many people, the question of whether you're actually buying nice things is more about, are the things you're buying nicer than other people's things? So the question of whether your home is big enough is actually just, is your home bigger than your neighbour's? Because that's the question you're trying to ask. So not only does an urge to one-up your peers exist, but you may also continually need to surpass your own spending. So i.e., is this vacation you take this year better than the one you took last year? Is your car fancier than your old car? Or you're not just trying to match your peers, you're actually trying to one-up yourself. Isn't that interesting, right? So here we are thinking it's all about comparison with others. So money to some people is less of an asset and more of a social liability. It indebts them to a status-chasing life and can leave them miserable. It's a dangerous trap. You don't recognise the game and how that game is. If you don't recognise the game and how it's played, it's been going on forever. So listen to this quote from 275 years ago from a guy by the name of Montesquieu. If you only wish to be happy, this could be easily accomplished. But we wish to be happier than other people, and this is always difficult, for we believe others to be happier than they are. There we go. So think about that, folks, when you're doing spending. Is your social hierarchy of spending got anything to do with your person over the fence, the person down the road, a mate who lives a couple of suburbs away, or trying to up what you've done before? Because to that last point, it's pretty easy to be happy if you really think about it. But when you're referencing to other people, it becomes an infinite game, Ben.
It does, and it's super dangerous if you're trying to keep up with the Joneses, right? And you're using debt to do that. So the only practical reason why measuring yourself to your peers is valuable is actually overspending. So, by way of example, in the Money Fit, you can compare yourself inside the More platform to your peers. And the goal with that is not about the outspending. It's about, is our spending excessive compared to that? So you can get a benefit on that side. But to Morgan Housel's point here, it's, trying to, continue to keep living this life of opulence and keeping up with the Joneses just isn't worth it. It's just not worth it. So, but certainly overspending on discretionary items and trying to measure against your peers in that respect to hopefully change behaviour around overspending can be very helpful in terms of building long-term financial freedom and financial comfort.
And if you really get this point, Ben, if you really allow it to land, what you will find is you'll probably acquire less stuff. That less stuff means you are less trapped, because the more you get into a debt cycle, even if it's a debt cycle that you can service, that debt cycle becomes the master of your domain. So if you're reducing the amount of times you need to impress someone else, who the man in the car paradox proved that they're not even looking anyway, means that the less commitments you have means the less money you need to actually receive the freedom that you actually want in the first place.
Yeah.
It is a really powerful concept if it lands, and we're all humans and we all fall victim to this at some point. But the secret sauce in it is, if you really do take this to heart, your expenses drop down to next to nothing, because all you need is a car that gets you from A to B, not one that you're trying to impress. All you need a house is that provides you shelter rather than one that you're trying to impress. All you need is going on holidays to rejuvenate and relax rather than trying to impress someone else. Easier said than done. That is why money is simple and behaviour is hard, folks. The behaviour is hard is the 80% of the equation, even though the money is simple. Seems to be 50%. It's not. It's
well said, mate. Well said.
Undoing the behaviours. Hey, we have got a very special guest today.
Yes.
We are talking to a man who has got an enormous amount of experience in the world of economics, because not only does he have access to a lot of incredible data at the REA Group, but previously worked for the RBA and got to look under the veil. We asked him a lot of questions about that, Ben. So let's cut to the interview you and I had recently with Paul Ryan. All right, Ben, we've got a very special guest today. We are chatting with Paul Ryan. He is an economist at REA, specialising in housing, finance, market forecasting and big data analysis. Before joining REA in December 2020, Paul spent a decade at the Reserve Bank of Australia conducting research on the Australian economy, focusing on housing markets, lending risks and regulatory effects on the property markets. Welcome to the Property Couch, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Hey, look, that RBA backstory, I think we're going to lean in on that at some stage in our conversation. But before we get there, Paul, given you're a first-time guest on the Property Couch, we'd love to get to know you a little bit better. And in the place that we always like to start with all of our guests, if you could just talk to us a little bit about what conversations were like for you growing up over the dinner table with regards to money.
It's a good start off. So I seem to recall that my family's pretty open with money. I don't think we talked about, ins and outs of the weekly budget. But it was more like the broad strokes of, anything you buy, has an opportunity cost. You can't buy something else with that money. And I seem to recall having early conversations about investing. I remember my mother trying to explain to me how shares worked, and I was just saying, you own part of the company. Couldn't understand which part. Do you get the chairs that people are sitting on, the front doors? So that perplexed me for some time. But it shows that we were talking about not just weekly ins and outs of money, but long term, what is wealth and things like that from a relatively young age.
And how did that play out in terms of, were your parents, in the economic side of things? Were they commerce driven, or were they science people? Or tell us a bit of the sort of makeup of how the house looked for you.
Both sciencey people, both vets, in fact. So I spent a lot of my youth in vet centres, and quickly decided that wasn't for me. A nice clean job with no blood is kind of what that pushed me towards. But it was general, lots of interest in economics and politics, I think, and that's what has kind of fed me into economics. So I was always a very analytical kind of person. That's I think what that pushed me towards. But yeah.
And how does that play out in terms of any other siblings also in the household? And because I'm curious how it plays out for your money habits and how you look at money. Are you a sort of delayed gratification person, or someone who wants to spend today and not worry about tomorrow? How does that play out for you?
I'm an extreme delayed gratification guy.
Extreme.
I squirrel stuff away, and once I feel like I've fully earned it, that's when I can reward myself. And I'm a big researcher, so to the point of $100 purchase, I'm there on the internet, on the forums, what's the best brand of, what do we do, a stick mixer? That's the last thing I bought. I'm what's the best one of these? Was it $70 at the end? I think that just comes from what's the the most efficient way to use the resources you've got That's I guess how I've always approached these problems. But yeah, probably to a bigger extent. My sister went the other way. She went into nursing, so the blood stuff probably rubbed off on her a bit more than me.
So
And I've got, sorry, let me, if I can round out that sort of story, like, so that's in everything you're doing in terms of like, do you get any paralysis by analysis if there's a certain threshold of price value? So if the transaction's a car over $20,000 or $30,000, does that sort of delay that purchase, or even, for property?
I think that where the inefficiency strikes is that I'll do a similar amount of research for a $200 thing as I will for a $30,000 car. I think that's where I'm not optimizing. By optimizing, I'm not optimizing, I think.
Yeah.
Extreme delayed gratification is a superpower when it comes to investing on the other side of action taking, right? So I wonder if the fact that you are a researcher and a $200 purchase is the same as a $200,000 purchase for you, the amount of research and input that you put into that has it been a what is your action threshold like in terms of, because you're at the coalface of understanding it to better than most people the machinations of how market forces work, and so have you been able to hack that side of your extreme delayed gratification and match it with your propensity to research so that you do find the appropriate amount of action threshold for you?
Yeah, and I think that's been like the lifelong journey is understanding like when are you comfortable to jump into these things. And yeah, a lot of the times I think what I've learned is I can't sit down and just say, okay, at the end of today, I'm going to have making a decision, say an investment decision or something similar. It'll be, I'll do some research and kind of let that sit in my brain for a while and then come back to it, a couple of weeks later and think, okay, how do I still feel about that? I think that's my approach there is if you still feel good about it a week later and it's not just I just, saw that ad on TV, and you still wanted it or need it, that's when kind of it's the right decision. That's where I've come to.
Nice one. Well played. All right, so let's pivot to your professional backstory, Paul. The RBA bit intrigues me. I'd like to find out a bit about that. But before that, what was your first? What was the first gig on your professional career once you graduated, and how did you go from vet science background to ending up in economics and one of the leading economists in the country? What was that first stepping stone?
So I think it was a combination of interests. So I love economics, and it was a really, really good choice for me. I almost studied political science at university, and I didn't do that when I realized that all of the elective subjects that I wanted to pick were all economic subjects. So I thought, why don't I just do economics so I can do political science on the side? And that is what I viewed economics is I've always been very analytical, very maths driven, and economics it's an enormously broad field, but broadly speaking, it is a analytical expression of how people operate in the world. So it's how do we understand what everyone together as a society is doing, and it's so influential. Like that's what I saw is all the interesting things in politics, all the big debates are fundamentally they're economics debates. So that's I'm really happy with it, and more I've done more and more data focused things, and that's kind of how I ended up in property, because that's how you really get into to understand things in a way that no one else can before. We've had this kind of renaissance of big data and more data availability, and that's been living that kind of moving from when I started my career to now. What's expected of an economist has changed enormously rapidly in 10, 15 years. And that's just been a really, really fun development.
Can you summarize those change in expectations? What would you have got away with a decade ago that you necessarily have more expectation on you now? So
I think economics has moved a bit from a theory basis. So if you think about, back in the, Keating days or 15, 20 years ago, economists had to have a really great grounding in the theory of how we thought the economy operated. And all we had was kind of aggregate data. We could see total spending, we could see total savings, we could see total economic activity. And since then, we've gotten much, much more data on what individual people are doing. And just that has meant that people can actually test, if you change this one policy, what effect does it have on specific outcomes? And so you're moving from, so you're still, economics is still very much grounded in theory. Is your the hypotheses you're testing are always, does human behavior respond as we'd expect with theory? But more and more you've been able to test these little kind of micro things. And that's been the big revelation is economics has gone from a very macroeconomics focused discipline to more and more it's a microeconomics focused discipline. It's more in the like, how are you or I making decisions? And with that, that's the stuff that really interests me, is like, if a tax policy changes, how many more people does that induce to do something or stop doing something they were doing before? Those I find the really interesting questions.
Yeah, true. And I guess working at REA too, you get sort of real-time feedback on some of the decisions that people are making, better than most, really, given the reach that you have. So that would really be playing into the strengths and the sandpits that you like to play in. So if we pivot to the RBA, can you, it's been on everyone's mind, the RBA, over the last interest rate tightening cycle. Can you give us a little insider's understanding on what it's like on the inside?
Sure. I spent just over a decade at the RBA. It was kind of the start of my career. It's a fantastic place to work. It was kind of the best. I was enormously lucky to start my career there. The amount of talent that is there is just vast. You're sitting next to people with PhDs, you're sitting next to people that have been researchers in the Australian economy for decades, and they take that really seriously. People are, they're researching every aspect of the Australian economy. And although I was never a kind of a macro focused guy, and that's obviously the place where real macro people go, to macro being people care about aggregate activity and how interest rates affects the economy and whether the economy is, performing stronger or weaker than expected. Whereas I was kind of in the micro details about, how do these little things affect people's behavior? The RBA does research on the whole breadth of the economy because they need to understand all of that to really get where the economy is at any point in time. So yeah, essentially what is great about it is that there's processes that go into the monetary policy decision, but then the thing you're pushing towards is everyone is trying to do their own individual research. And so you are professionally a researcher in both topics that the RBA as an institution finds interesting, but also you've got a lot of license yourself to do research the Australian economy, aspects of the economy that other people haven't looked at yet. And that's just, there's not many places that you can work where you've got a kind of free license to do research and with the only goal of being, can we just understand what's going on better?
It's a really fascinating insight that we, the general public don't necessarily get to see, Paul. And so I think, what's pleasing about that is that what you're talking about, I mean, we know economics is basically the study of human behavior, as you were saying before, and obviously the incentives around that human behavior, whether we're going to act or not act. Did you get close to any of the sort of research that was being done about driving property activity? Like, ultimately there's this great debate around negative gearing and, is that a stimulus to actually get supply into the market? Is it not a stimulus? I mean, it's those types of macro policy decisions that do impact, not only just in the short term, but medium to longer term in terms of the level of supply that we're going to see made available for what is these days, a differing type of economy where we've got people who are happily mobile. They'll happily move from place to place for work. I talk a lot about, the risk you have of just thinking about a certain type of renter that just is stuck and wants to stay in the one particular space, as opposed to human talent and that human capital and the mobility of that human capital is important to develop areas and regions and being able to sort of see those cities and those towns grow. So was there any sort of experiences of any research you were doing in the RBA that sort of exposed you to a bit of that sort of insight?
Yeah, absolutely. And the RBA, property is such a fundamental part of the Australian economy that the RBA has a lot of interest. And you would have seen the RBA has put out papers on the housing market, and probably, the best papers there are on the Australian housing market. the really fun kind of bit that I contributed to was when, again, after the global financial crisis, there was this big push to say, hey, the housing market is this huge risk. It can be this huge risk. It was a huge risk overseas, particularly in the United States and places like Ireland and Spain. How do we understand these risks? And that's when I think regulation in Australia has moved, away from kind of what was called like prudential regulation, which is what APRA does, which is basically banks just have to hold capital. And then other than that, do lend in an appropriate way to people, but make up your own mind about how you lend. And it's become a much more targeted in how regulators impact lending. And this culminated in what APRA or other people call macroprudential measures, which it was deemed in late 2014 that investor lending was a risk to the Australian economy, basically. And so there were limits on how many investors banks could lend to. And later there were limits on interest-only lending. Interest-only lending was a risk. And so I think I played a small part in researching, what are the impacts of these things? Firstly, is investor lending a risk? What are the mechanisms? So what's the theory behind that? What's the evidence of it? What happens when you implement these things, which culminated in higher interest rates for investors and interest-only loans, which persist to this day, despite those kind of limits being removed. For reasons we can get into, banks are still charging a premium to investors today. These are the types of things that I was looking at while I was there, as well as, the broader questions here are what you spoke about, Ben. People move around less now than they used to. Why is that? Is that because of high housing prices? Is that just because, the economy is less dynamic, it's less productive? And we see that everywhere, not just in Australia. There's fewer people move around the United States than they used to. There are hypotheses for this and papers, really good papers about it. But this is one of the things. If we're talking about productivity, I'm sure you would have seen there's this like the housing theory of everything. Like to what extent are people getting married later and having families later because housing's expensive? Or is housing expensive because people are delaying this stage of their life because more people want a university education? Untangling these things and I think housing is such an important thing to people, really, right? It's almost always your largest asset is your home. If we think about why has Australia gotten wealthy over time, it's because everything's gotten cheaper, really. You have to spend less of your work week to buy clothes and food. And the one thing that's gotten more expensive relative to, say, your parents is housing. So increasingly, housing is an important focus for welfare. That's why it's so interesting. And sorry, I rambled there a bit, but kind of takes you on a journey of why all these things are so interrelated and why they're important, and why does the RBA, which really should care about interest rates and what's going on with economic activity, why are they researching housing? Because they know that it's such an important thing for the long run productive capacity of the economy.
It's such an important story around our community understanding all of the interwoven connectivity that, the fabric that does make up that, economic measurements and looking at, again, all of those behavioural traits. I want to double click on the APRA assessment of risk in investor side. I mean, all of the papers and all of the banking people that I've been able to talk to over the last 15, 20 years have indicated to me that in terms of default risk, the greater proportion of default risk actually comes from owner occupiers as it does from investors. Yet, obviously, you can see the natural response from a regulator seeing what happened in the US where they've got no recourse borrowing versus we've got full recourse borrowing here. So it's a little bit of a different sort of outcome. But what was the sort of evidence to suggest that investor activity was such a greater risk? I mean, I definitely also flagged, and Bryce and I were quite concerned in, I think it was 2014-15, where 50% of new lending was going to investors. That was unsustainable. There was no doubt that was problematic, and certainly some of those macroprudential throttles that we saw coming out there were well founded in terms of, everyone's irrational behaviour, thinking that property is, the gold mine to the future. But I am curious to your point. You said that the major banks and most lenders have still put a premium on top of the investor lending, when the irony here is, based on the evidence that I've seen, we're actually a lower risk than what you're seeing from owner-occupiers. And everyone might be going, why would there be a higher risk for owner-occupiers? Well, in a lot of cases, a lot of relationship breakdowns, debt management, financial household management becomes quite challenging. Having families, unplanned, all of those things add up to a greater groundswell of risk in the owner-occupier space. But tell us what you learned in terms of your own research.
So the theory of these risks is that fundamentally investors can amplify housing market cycles. So prices are going up. Investors say, I'm seeing prices going up. Someone at the barbecue told me that this area is a good place to invest in. More investors buy in that location. That pushes prices up more, say above some theoretical fundamental value. And at some point that unwinds. And on the downslope, it's investors who can leave. Owner-occupiers, fundamentally, they need somewhere to live. They're less likely to say, hey, I think prices are going to go down in my suburb. I'm going to sell now. And
pitch tent.
Yeah, it can happen. But we think the idea is that investors are this like flighty money that can come in and leave and pump prices up and then cause prices to fall. And that has real effects on the owner-occupiers that live there, right? Like if prices are down 10% and an owner-occupier has to refinance, they can't do it. If they lose their job, so on and so forth, like that's they can't sell their house if you're underwater in a position of negative equity. It can have these really bad effects, even though fundamentally, if you're still living in the house, it doesn't matter until you sell.
So that's the hypothetical risk. But we haven't actually seen that really play out in too many cases across the country.
Not in Australia. There's some evidence in the US that some of the regions that saw the biggest upswing and then downswing in prices, that was partly due to
Arizona.
Increased investor activity. So I think that explanation does have legs. So then it comes to, so how do you deal with that? The most effective way to deal with that potentially is just have really high transaction costs, which is really what stamp duty is. Getting in and out of the market costs you an enormous amount.
Yeah.
So that's as much as I'm very much not a fan of stamp duty for broader productivity and efficiency reasons, that's the biggest argument for stamp duty continuing in this country, I think. But what's occurred at the moment is now those macroprudential measures have been removed. What they've been replaced with is this very complicated system of capital requirements for different loans. And so banks have to hold fundamentally more capital against an investor loan than an owner-occupier loan. So now my critique of that is how do you calibrate that? What's the right amount of extra capital to balance against these risks? Because as you say, right, in good times, before the pandemic, you see lower arrears rates or lower rates of default for investors than owner-occupiers. And that's partly because investors tend to be higher income, higher wealth, partly because of the part of the life stage that they're at. But in downturns, there's, the RBA has some a paper on default risks that showed that in the post mining boom WA regional areas, so very small housing markets, they did see investor arrears rates increase a bit more than owner occupiers. So there's there is some evidence here that the theory translates into actuality. Now, I think my critique is before we go out there and we charge all of these people, what is it at the moment? The premiums, 30 to 40 basis points more for an investor than an owner occupier. That's a real cost to a third of the market. There should be some more evidence on the level of risk and whether that additional cost is commensurate with that risk.
But we know that the banks aren't going to run that that equation, right? I mean, at the end of the day, their net interest margin is being squeezed anyway. So unless that comes from the academia or the RBA or the regulators, it's not going to come really from the banks because they are able to make that difference.
Maybe there'll be more so I worked closely with APRA when I was at the Reserve Bank, and APRA and the RBA have a very close convivial working relationship. And yeah, hopefully that will come. I think that's when APRA has started to look at these measures. They've released papers that say here are the conditions under which we would implement new macroprudential policies. Again, my critique of this is like they're like, hey, we just look at the market and we'd say that we need more measures. I'm like, okay, well, how about we do the research now and like what those measures should look like and what effect they have, right? Because I mean, the research that we released that I worked on at the RBA was that those higher interest rates for investors did affect home prices. So in regions that had more investors, we saw home prices increase more slowly than other parts of the country. So again, that impacts not just the investors who are not making those gains, it impacts everyone who has a house in that region.
And the tenants who also have to pay higher rent because the holding costs become higher. And,
potentially,
they're the ones we want to see eventually saving a deposit and getting into the property market at some point as well. So that these are to your point, the intended and unintended consequences of any sort of macroprudential policy.
Now, to be clear, my conclusion here is not that like the regulators are wrong. It's that we should base any regulation in good evidence. That's I think my point.
Well, it's interesting that the breadth of the evidence that you are chasing at the RBA, and I'm interested to know what sort of energy, how much energy did you get to spend on comparing our market to other international markets? You just sort of hinted at some of the cases there in the US. Did you get to reference a broad spectrum of countries? And you're nodding there. So what sort of comparisons and interesting anomalies did you notice in the Australian market compared to some of the other bigger international countries that you were observing?
So I think the big anomaly in Australia is that investment properties or rental properties are provided by households. And that's important for like risks. I mean, you'll see every month there'll be an article saying household debt in Australia is high. Why is household debt in Australia high relative to, say, the United States or the UK? The number one reason is that all of the debt for the rental stock is held by the household sector, not by the corporate sector. If you take that away, is Australia more indebted than other countries? A little bit, but nowhere near the 100% more of percent of household income than anywhere else. That's a big reason, right? So if you're thinking about risks, like how much risk does the housing sector hold? Those kind of stats overstate that. That's now why in Australia do corporates not buy rental properties? Why is it always households? That's then the next big important question. And is that a risk? And subsequently, is that bad for people? Is it bad for renters to have a mum and dad owning their home? Now, to go through that, mainly it's tax settings that mean that households are incentivized, or they have basically an advantage over corporates buying rental properties. Now, mostly that's land tax. So if a corporate buys a whole bunch of properties, they're going to end up paying land tax on the whole portfolio. A household, New South Wales, less so in places like Victoria, you pay no land tax because you've got a threshold under which you don't pay any. So there's kind of these structural reasons that we kind of, at the moment, we're kind of stuck with what we've got. There's huge pressure for more build-to-rent investment, and how can we encourage more build-to-rent investment? And really, the answer overseas is they give huge tax breaks to people, to corporates to build housing. Maybe that's the answer. Is if you make it really, really attractive for corporates to build housing, they will build it. Now, whether it's bad, is it bad for households or renters to have their home owned by another household? That's an interesting question, because it says, the ideal here is that suppose you're a renter and you're a renter with a big corporate, and you say, I've got to move house for work and I'm moving from Sydney to Brisbane. And your landlord says, oh, great, I've got another building in Brisbane. I know you're a good renter. You can just move straight to that. That's really appealing. I haven't rented overseas, so I don't know how realistic that vision of the corporate-owned rental stock is. But it's an interesting one, and I think it speaks to, I think, a lot of, if you talk to renters, a lot of their concerns are about like professionalization of property managers and quality of rental accommodation. And I think those people that are pushing for more corporate-owned rental properties are doing so for to have higher quality rental accommodation. I think that's something we all kind of agree is a good thing. I think when I talk to build to rent developers, in fact, they say it's profitable to provide high quality rental accommodation because you get less renter churn. So they say it washes its face. You get a good return from providing high quality rental accommodation. And so I think there doesn't have to be an either or here, right? I think everyone can win.
Yeah, I think it's got to be part of that mix, doesn't it? I mean, ultimately, we, as the chair of the Property Investors Council of Australia, we're sort of saying, yeah, build to rent's got to come in. We do need more of that affordable housing. I'm trying to remember what the paper was that I read, but the cost for governments to provide social and public housing and those types of, because of the compliance levels and the cleanliness and the rotation and all that, it actually doesn't sound like it's as efficient as potentially the way in which these small business owners, because that's what they are, it's a passive business, but the mum and dad investor, they're running a small little business and they've got a property manager who's obviously holding them on. So I hope that the sort of powers that be and the regulators and all of that that are having these conversations aren't saying this or this. It should be and rather than or in terms of the blend of accommodation that's being provided, because I think I could argue quite strongly that a good quality property that's well looked after by its landlord is providing quiet and clean enjoyment and safe enjoyment for that, and that's pretty efficient, because the only sort of middle ground cost in there is the property manager, who might be taking about 8.5%, 9%, in terms of their fee on the rent. So it's definitely, to your point around the land tax, that's the other challenge. I mean, there's probably a lot of property investors who would happily add to their portfolios, but the land tax is exactly the same for the investor as it is for the business who's trying to provide volume. But to your point, there's no one owner household's going to be able to provide 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 affordable rental accommodation in a meaningful way. They'll never get the lending.
Yeah. I think that's right.
So I guess I'm interested in your assessment of what's happened in the property market since the beginning of the year, Paul, because clearly there's at the back end of last year there was the interest rate tightening cycle was in full force, but the East Coast and the bigger cities have actually performed really well for the beginning of the year. So what's your take on that, and do you see that as sustainable, or do you think that there is I guess some flattening out of that to come?
It's been a really interesting year for property, although really it's been a really interesting kind of 3 years for property. I've been really surprised by home price growth this year. We put out forecasts in January that had, similar to a lot of forecasts in the market, that were very negative, following on from really what was 6 to 8 months of price falls throughout the second half of 2022. Now, since then, what's happened? Interest rates have continued to go up, although looking like flattening out now. But prices have increased every month this year. Capitals are up now over the past 12 months, like 2%. Regional areas are flat over the past 12 months. So they've kind of regained everything all the falls that happened in the second half of 2022 have been regained now. In most markets, not everywhere. Sydney's been leading the charge, the most expensive market. So what's surprised us has been the weight of demand this year relative to kind of new stock coming on the market. That's been kind of the key factor here, is that demand's been much stronger than we expected, and partly I'm speaking about stronger like catch-up immigration, but mostly I'm referring to really how households have reorganized themselves since the pandemic. There's been a big increase in the amount of space people want. People want, bedrooms, spare bedrooms for home offices, bigger gardens because they're working from home. And that's translated into, really, we need more homes for the same number of people than we did before the pandemic. And so that weight of demand has been really much stronger than we expected. Now, is that sustainable? A really good follow-up question. It's tough. I mean, the way that I always think about home price valuations is always in this, like, in an asset pricing framework. So fundamentally, what people can borrow really affects where prices are at. And over the long run, that is what you see. And we've seen a big divergence over the past year. Borrowing capacity since mid 2022 is down somewhat like a third, and we've now got prices roughly flat over that period. So the chief risk is that what we've seen over the past 6 months is we've seen lots of buyers with really big deposits. So borrowing kind of half or less than a property's value. So people who are less affected by these interest rate increases. Now, we don't know who those people are, but you can hypothesize that these are people that need more space since the pandemic, have seen really big equity increases. That's the other big story, is that people who are already in the property market have seen huge property price gains over the past 3 years. So on one side, you run out of those buyers that have really big deposits and aren't as affected by interest rate increases, and you start to get the long-term trend of borrowing capacities really driving price increases. That might be what we see. But fundamentally, I don't know, we still see really strong demand in the market. All our indicators, auction clearance rates are really strong. Properties are starting to sell quickly again. I was wrong at the start of the year, so I'm much more reticent to make bold claims. For the next few months or so, it looks like we're going to continue to see property price growth.
So, Paul, I mean, that's obviously the really interesting question. So I'll get to the forward estimates of supply coming in and just how deep that base of demand is. What did you see? You were talking about predominantly owner occupiers then, when you were saying more space and potentially gardens, and those people working from home wanting more area to move around for their quiet enjoyment. So what about the investor? What did you see investors' activity in the last sort of 6 months play into that story, or was and has there been price points where you may have seen them a little bit more active than not active?
So yeah, we've seen investors come back into the market. So we've seen all activity drop off since interest rate increases have taken hold. But we've seen investors fall a bit less than other segments of the market. So we've got investors making up around a third of new credit, which is roughly where they were before the pandemic. The pandemic was a really challenging period for investors. Lots of investors sold properties. Very few new investors came into the market. It was a big shift. So fundamentally, what happened is a lot of first home buyers bought the property they were renting in. There was a big transfer from investors to first-home buyers. Now, that the big people that are really crimped by higher interest rates are first-home buyers who tend to borrow. Your standard first-home buyer is borrowing 80 LVR. They're really, really affected by interest rate increases. So it's no surprise that first-home buyer activity has dropped off, and investors have come back to filling that void. It's also the case that investors tend to have higher wealth. There's a big divergence in what strategies investors have. Some want to maximize leverage, want to have as much negative gearing capacity as possible. But that's not all investors. A lot of investors are actually like, hey, property is a good investment. I'm going to put real money in there and don't actually have a huge amount of leverage. So there's a wide divergence there, but broadly you can say that investors tend to be older and they tend to be wealthier, and so they've taken up more of the market as they're less affected by higher interest rates.
You touched on regional performance being flat. During COVID, it was the last person to leave the capital city turn the lights out because everyone was heading that way. And one of the things that Ben and I spoke of, and a couple of the guests we had during that time, Paul, was around where does the commuter belt actually stretch to, right? Because it was all right when everyone was just leaving, but it feels like we're now in that U-turn stage where people are thinking, okay, well, it's gone a fair way out and it's not close to the major hubs. Do you have a view on where that commuter belt might have stretched to? And also, is there a bunch of U-turn happening from a lot of these further out regional centres?
So I think there's two different trends here. Now, the pandemic period was easily the biggest preference shift in the housing market since probably World War II. So there's a lot to unpack about how people changed, what they're willing to pay for. Now, within cities, what we saw is that people were willing to pay more for bigger homes. So no matter where it was, if it was a house close to the CBD or in a far-flung area, people were willing to pay more for big 4 and 5 bedroom houses. Now, there are more of those in peripheral suburbs. So this is the key driver of like the outperformance of that really peripheral belt of suburbs to the edges of cities. And you could almost map that the further a suburb was from the CBD, it would have performed better through the COVID period. But if if we look at all the data, and again, this is the fun thing of having all the data on every single property transaction, all of that outperformance is about size of homes, not location. So people weren't, despite the fact that people were doing this hybrid thing or working from home persistently, people weren't willing to pay more to be further from the CBD. They were willing to pay more for bigger houses. But we did see people be willing to pay more to live in regional areas, particularly regional areas that were kind of 1-2 hours away from major cities. So thinking like Geelong, Mornington Peninsula for Melbourne, places like Wollongong and the Central Coast for Sydney. Now, we've seen that reverse a little bit, but we're still seeing regional areas all across the country up significantly more than capital cities since the pandemic period and since kind of 2015. But that's not that unusual. We did see like capital cities outperform in the period before that. If you map, one of the things that we kind of look at for this is the ratio between, say, house prices in regional Victoria relative to Melbourne house prices. And it kind of oscillates around a bit. And we're not like drastically outside of the range that you'd consider normal. So what does this tell you? Is that I think really there's just been a catch up in regional areas, and there are more people that are willing to live in regional areas and take advantage of lifestyle. Obviously relative affordability. Those are the big things. So it does seem to be a real trend. It's obviously regional areas haven't outperformed over the past year, so maybe we've seen this one burst for regional areas, and now they'll kind of stay at this level for prices.
The relationship between inner and outer and regional, we talk about it being the ripple effect, because ultimately from where we sit, it's the land value that ultimately is the sustained value, coming back to, what is the intrinsic or deep value that you get in property. It's ultimately the land value. And that's why, land closer to the big economic centres has appreciated significantly over that time. And obviously it's the productive use of that land that ultimately gets its land value from. When you see this divergence between, the sort of behaviour of people moving out there, and we talk a lot about land to asset ratio, and so when the actual asset on top of the property, the improvements on the land start to get higher than that sort of 40%, and you're starting to get that, we tend to see a performance in our research or an underperformance of those particular assets. So the question I have for you is, given how rich the data you have, which is all the properties and all of those sale prices, I mean, ultimately at some point in time, that's falling into the land values when we look at, those inner city land values being at a premium to the mid-city locations, to the fringe city, to then those regional areas. Do you see that changing anytime soon in terms of how the makeup of land values would change, and what would be the catalyst for that change?
A lot to unpack there, and you guys are definitely the experts in those kind of valuation topics here. I think what I can add here is the way that economists think about like cities and values within cities is similar to kind of like a gravity model. So as cities get bigger, the gravity of the center of the city gets larger, and so values go up more closer to the higher gravity areas than they do further away. It becomes more and more valuable to be close to kind of all of the action and all of the people and where productivity is occurring and where jobs are happening. So
livability, all of those aspects that come into it. Yep.
Exactly right. So like you think about, on one hand, people are concerned about like upzoning and high density and things like that. And on the one hand, you end up with cheaper houses or apartments or townhouses. but you contribute to that kind of gravity, and so that kind of brings benefits to everyone, and that's really clear when you live in medium to high density suburbs where there's lots of restaurants, lots of cafes, there's lots of people around, there's like lots of stuff to do. You can see the appeal, and from my perspective as a housing economist, this seems like unambiguously good. People can still choose, and ideally we develop our cities so there's a big choice of different dwelling types, but we can accommodate more people, and everyone gets the benefit of that. I think that's what I'm looking forward to our cities developing towards.
And I think you've got a great story which we'll put in a link in the show description on that, about we're just not building property where people want to live. But just on the back of that story, for our investor community here as well, is as some of those lots get repurposed into higher, more productive use, i.e. single lots go into double or go into, townhouses or into multi, sort of low density to medium density. Those individual lots that are still remaining, because of that gravity effect, it actually increases the value of that land. So from an investor's point of view, don't be too worried about that population increase, because it'll bring that Thai restaurant next to the Indian restaurant, next to the coffee shop, and bring that attractiveness and that livability and those other small businesses and the employment opportunities and potentially the higher income that plays off that particular story as well. So that's the fascination that I see in that sort of, that fundamental in-field work that we get to do, as opposed to, that doesn't necessarily show up in the median house prices, of which we're reporting the results of the sales. We're thinking, sort of 10, 15, 20, 30 years time in terms of what's happening to that parcel of dirt. And the reality is, as everyone else is spending around your pallet of dirt and you've just got a simple house on that, from an investor's point of view, that's a great return for you, because ultimately, again, you've got more of the value in the land than you have in the improvements.
Absolutely. I mean, all of the research, one of the actual interesting ways that economists value, like, all sorts of amenities, things that you can't otherwise value, things like parks, things like schools. One of the easiest ways to do that is with houses. So you look at a house that's close to a park or a house that's in a school zone compared with one that's not in a school zone, and some component of that difference in value turns out to be, it is capitalized. People actually are willing to pay for these amenities, and the housing, the kind of lived experience, shows that up in the data. It's a really fascinating part of it.
It is fascinating, all right.
Hey Paul, how do you observe supply? Because clearly, if we want to solve some of the affordability challenges, we need to provide more supply into the marketplace. Ben just hinted on the blog article that you did write around homes not being built around the infrastructure where people need them to be. But how do you see the supply challenge being solved? And probably with an eye on the recent Labor government announcement to provide incentives to actually fast track some of the rubbish that people have to get through to actually, because everyone agrees on paper it's supply, but it's actually how we fulfill it is the challenge. So can you speak to that point from the economist's point of view and with an eye on last week's announcement?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really encouraged by the National Cabinet announcement last week. I think we know we need to build more homes, and I agree with you, Bryce, that the it's a discussion about where and what. Now, how do we build more homes in our cities? This is inevitably really hard. Planning approval is hard. It takes many years. It's expensive. Locals object overwhelmingly to new development, although there are now these YIMBY movements that are saying, yes, we do want more housing for all the reasons that we discussed. At the moment, the places that it's easy to build homes are peripheral suburbs for detached housing. So throughout the pandemic period, when we had things like Home Builder, we built a huge amount of homes in Sydney, kind of the southwest of the city, to Melbourne, to the kind of northwest and west of the CBD, but very, very far away from the CBD. That's easy, right? We take farmland, we package it up, and we sell new detached housing on that land. The other one is industrial infill. So where there were factories close to CBDs, we can knock those down and they inevitably become high density These are the relatively easy things, and if you look at a map about where development's happening, you see that it's very peripheral for houses. It's in very small areas, basically because state governments say, okay, we're going to do this area now. All developers go and just densify this one suburb that used to be industrial. And I think the big challenge is that puts a huge amount of burden on those parts of the cities that are receiving that development. It would be much fairer if we had fairer and more efficient in terms of, everyone wants the benefits of density, and people want as few of the costs of higher density as possible. And the kind of fairest way you can think of doing that is spreading that more widely. Now, that doesn't happen because it's really hard to do, say, residential upfill. So they're taking a large family block and splitting it up into 3 townhouses. But I think the National Cabinet announcement, and the thing that I was most pleased by, is incentivizing states and saying, because previously what's happened is, hey, we're going to set a target at the state level for you to build a number of homes. We don't care how you do it, go away and make it happen. And same thing, those states then go to their councils and say, okay, we've allocated you and a number of houses to build. We don't care how you do it. And councils say, why would we do this? Like, we can absolutely say, yes, we're going to fulfill our requirements. And then at the end say, oh, well, they didn't meet our very stringent requirements for density, which... But if we get into this position where we're saying, okay, well, if you can do this, we're going to pay you money. That's how economists think about, all incentives should work. And yes, I'm coming at it from a very economist-focused thing. But if that trickles down to saying, hey, councils, you will get more money for services and parks and the things you want to build for your residents if you just approve more homes, that seems like the way to achieve this to me.
Seems like common sense.
Yeah, like rather than having these arguments and forcing it on people by saying you have to do this and it's because the government says so. If it's more like, hey, the council goes to its populace and says, hey, look, if we allow some more housing in our area, we can also have all of these services that will be great for everyone who lives there, and more people will live in the suburb to take advantage of those services. That to me seems like a win-win.
You show me the incentive, and I'll show you the activity.
Yeah, I mean, have you read the book For Economics by?
I have, yes,
I mean,
years ago.
It's just 101, isn't it? It's just economics is just a study of human incentives, and if you like, to your point that you just said beautifully, then if you give people the right incentives, you actually get the outcomes that you want. So, good feedback around the cabinet decision then. Hey, as we head towards wrapping up our time with you, you are at the in the privileged position to see an incredible amount of insights of data there at REA. Is there any particular data that you look at that is unique to you that you think gives you a bit of an edge for being able to make your forecast, given that you are at the coalface of a lot of decisions that people are actually making? Is there any particular stat or group of data that you like to go to?
So I think the most unique data we have. So I mean, part of the reason I moved to REA from public sector researching was fundamentally like an interest in the housing market and how it affects welfare, but also just the data. We have the biggest amount of data on the housing market, and you can do just amazing things with it. We have, I think, what we're looking to tap more and more is we can see where people are searching for homes and how they're interacting with homes. So we can see like how many people there are that are kind of in those late stages of the buying process and tracking them over time and seeing kind of where are they looking. These are all really interesting things that I think are the next kind of wave of understanding the property market is I think what we've done is we understand a lot about houses, right? We understand what houses sell and how much they sell for. And, if it's got an extra bedroom, it sells for this much extra, and linking it to people. Who are the people that are buying it, and how do people value different things differently, and where are people moving from and to? I think that's the next kind of stage that I'm really excited to understand, because I think that's, if we want to understand what's going to happen in the future, I think we need to understand where people are looking before they're there. And I think we're in a unique position to understand that. And they're the kind of exciting things that I'm kind of starting to look into.
As the biggest search portal in the country, that makes sense, right? You're going to have the critical level of data that's going to give you that critical mass to be able to get those insights. So that's going to be fascinating to see what comes of that analysis, Paul. So I'm really keen to see when that's going to be released. In terms of my final question for you is probably a two-part question. Comes down to interest rate outlook, I think we're close to the top, but I'm keen on your thoughts on that. And the second part of that is then the APRA buffer rate. I mean, obviously, APRA's main responsibility is around the financial stability of the system and the risk that property presents to that financial stability of the system. We're coming to a point where ultimately, by having that restrictive setting in place around borrowing power, that could have a counterproductive outcome for those people who may be, forced to sell or difficult to refinance. And I know we've got these new sort of creative placements that are going through, but that's probably helping about from our analysis earlier, it's probably helping 1 in 10 borrowers that are stuck in potentially mortgage prison. So what are your thoughts on what APRA should be doing around reducing that buffer rate, if we're quite confident now that we're in significantly contractory territory in terms of what we're seeing around consumer spending? We saw unemployment spike last week. So give us some feedback on the sort of broader economic story there.
So I agree that we're close to the top of rates. That seems to be more and more people's expectation as we see the economy slow, or really we're seeing the data reflect where the economy was, 6 months ago, and that's evolving, I think, as the RBA was expecting. I kind of a few months ago was expecting higher interest rates given just how strong inflation was, but I'm kind of easing those expectations now. In terms of buffer rate, I think the buffer rate is actually a really interesting policy and one that I've talked about a lot. I actually wrote an article about how do I think the buffer should be set? And if we had a whole program, I guess I could run you through that. But broadly, I think it's not really APRA's place to be forecasting where interest rates are going to be in the future. And if you're going to say, hey, APRA, we think that the only way that mortgage rates are going to go from here is down, so therefore the buffer should be reduced, that actually is asking APRA to do quite a lot, because they have to then be forecasting the economy, or they have to be using, say, market expectations for the cash rate, which jump around enormously quickly. So it's actually it seems really logical, but you're actually asking quite a lot of additional capability for APRA to be able to set that. I kind of view that, why don't we just have a simple buffer that's just the same all the time? It's never going to change. APRA is committed to this, and it's based on research, right? Again, comes back to, can we do the research on this? And so I wrote an article and looked at what interest rate risks have households faced in the past, going back to kind of the 60s or 70s. And it seems like a 3 percentage point buffer, which is what we have now, covers 98% of all the increases in rates that households have experienced in the past. So that to me seems like a good setting. I wouldn't quibble if you wanted to make it 2.5 percentage points, but I think fundamentally, it should be based on research, and it should just be stable and constant throughout the cycle. I think a mortgage broker or a lender should be able to go, okay, I know what this setting is. The RBA is already changing rates with the cycle. You don't want buffer rates changing with the cycle as well. I think that's just, I don't think you actually get that much more out of this additional complexity, although it would be helpful to borrowers at the moment. I think there are general benefits for just simplicity in a lot of these regulations.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I read that article with great interest, and I was curious about what you're saying, because obviously there is a throttling element to what they did from going from 2% to the 3%. It's definitely impacted serviceability and that borrowing power, and that has had a flow-on effect. So to your point, if 2.5 is it, and we know that it is going to be it for a while, the markets will sort themselves out in terms of what that looks like. I think to your point around being perfect around risk mitigation at sort of say 95 to 98, my judgment call on that is I'd probably prefer to be in that sort of 85 to 90%, because at the end of the day, we want mobility and economic activity, and we want all of those other benefits that you get from growing the pie. Because that to me, it does feel like that 3% is just a bit too high in terms of that risk profiling. But I love the article, and I love the research you did on that and the story you tell in that particular.
I think that's the starting point we should be. Is hey, the research says this. Here's why I think this is the level of risk I think borrowers should take on or not. That's rather than us quibbling about interest rates will be lower in the future, or no, they won't. Or I think that's where we should be starting.
Nice one.
Paul, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. You and I recently appeared on a podcast with REA called REA Talk, where all the property investors going. So I reached out to you and said, would you like to join us? We're certainly glad that you did that. And on behalf of everyone here at the Property Couch, thanks for sharing your insights today, mate.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great fun.
Thanks, Paul.
See you, mate.
See ya.
Oh, mate, well, there you go. There's someone who is incredibly talented at numbers and reading the play and how that all moves together economically. And as we talked about in the interview, is at the controlling wheel of some of the very best data that's available for us as property folks, because they get to see the behaviours of what people are doing to a very intimate level, given they're the highest clicked site in their lane.
Yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to get access to someone like Paul. And I've always, mental note to myself is always whenever Paul's speaking or whether he's released a report or something like that, I'm an active listener or an active reader in terms of the insights that he gets, because fundamentally evidence-based, some of the critical thinking and some of the more difficult topics he is looking to challenge and get some further insights around the property market in this country. Like, there is obviously an affordability crisis in some aspects of the marketplace. There's rental challenges going on, but it's also looking at all of that data and seeing, some of those critical drivers that are really evidence-based in that data and the behaviour of what he's seeing on those platforms. So, yep, absolute privilege to have Paul on the show. Hopefully we can get him back one day into the future, because, his data makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I collaborated with Paul recently on the REA podcast called Real Talk. So we might put a link to that in the show notes too, Ben, if anyone's interested in listening to that. But it was nice to meet him then. I asked him to come back on to our podcast, and he was more than happy to do that. So I think our community is the beneficiary of him taking us up on that offer. So my life hack today, Ben, is I'm going through this little YouTube phase and trying to find a few little hacks in YouTube. And I don't know if anyone knows that we have really upped our YouTube game at the Property Couch here, Ben. So if you go to our channel, our incredible team of Stigs here have now, we used to be 95% audio. It starts as a video, and then we strip the audio out and put that up on the podcast platform. And so, do you know at the beginning, Ben, how you and I bang on about footy and blah, 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 that some people might, we get 50% of our audience says, keep it up. 50% of our audience says, you make my ears bleed, can you stop? So if you want to get to the bit where you want to share the video, there is a little function where you push share on the YouTube video, and then it gives you a point. Say you want it to start at 1:30 in, or for us, it's probably, 3 minutes 47 or something?
Maybe a lot later, maybe.
Well, I was just keeping my status up there, Ben, by not admitting my faults too much. But say you wanted to send it to someone and let it start at 3 minutes 47. You're able to do that. There's a little box that you can tick, start at 3:47. What it'll do is it'll create the embed code that'll start it. So when the person clicks on the link, it'll go straight there at that point and kick it in. So given that I'm on a little YouTube learning optimization strategy, and I've been sharing a few videos around, I discovered that. And for some of you might go, oh, duh. And for others, you might go, oh, that's pretty cool.
I definitely learned something today, Bros. Definitely learned something.
Hey, mate, here, please. Hey, what's making property news, mate?
Mate, what's making property news? The one thing that I want to really focus in on in this particular update is, at the moment, around the country, we should be receiving rates. Now, in Victoria, we know that obviously through the Andrews government, there's been an increased level of land tax that's going to be charged as part of the COVID recovery levy. And so there's going to be more people than ever before in Victoria, around, I think, 600,000 extra people who are going to have land tax for the first time. So what's on your rates notice is going to be how they charge you for land tax. Now, we also know that valuations occur usually once every couple of years when it comes to your rates notice. So if you want to object to the valuation that you see on your rates notice, which is going to impact the level of tax that you pay, you only have, and this is the big point in terms of the big message, you only have 2 months to put your objection in from the time that you've received your rate notice. So you must act quickly. If you do not put an objection in by that time, bad luck. Unfortunately, bad luck. Now, there are multiple grounds of which you can object to the valuation or the information on the rates notice. So we're going to put in the show notes a link to basically the rating valuation objection portal, and that will give you some information if your property is here in Victoria. Obviously, the main one in which people can object to is on the grounds that the valuation assigned is either too high or too low, or the interest held in the property by various persons to the land have not been correctly apportioned, so et cetera, right? So I'm not going to read through all of them, but you'll see them all there in effectively the Valuation of Land Act 1960 for Victoria. Ooh. So there's a link to that in the first link that we put in the show description. So it's just a really important message that with higher land taxes potentially going to be apportioned across the nation, if you don't believe your property is worth the value that is shown on that, you've got to act quickly, because if you don't act within that window, unfortunately, your objection is going to fall on deaf ears.
Very good advice. There you go, folks. Check that out. Make sure you act if you're a Victorian property owner. Very good advice. All right. So, mate, we covered a lot of ground today. Thank you to all of our contributors at the top and the tail, and also definitely for Paul Ryan for his wisdom and his insights. And it won't be the last time that we get Paul on this podcast, mate. But until next week, buddy.
Knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks.